Well, as you will have known from previous video that I did earlier on, I've been rather silent on YouTube lately, and that's basically because I've been head down in software development. So I thought, given the large period of time since the last post I did to YouTube, it might be a pertinent point to put out another video to show where I'm at and what I've been up to. First and foremost, the last, what is it? It's probably almost 2 months, I guess, since I did a last video post. What I've spent most of that time doing is continuing on with my high channel support of Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer, and in particular the elephant in the room, that is VST3 hosting. Initially I had some hopes of actually using the code that's within the VST API libraries to help me do that, but after mucking around with that for a bit and figuring out that it's way more complicated than it needs to be in my case, and it has limitations and technical issues associated with it, I basically have built my own hosting implementation largely from scratch. I have used a couple of components from the VST3 library, but that's mainly the, if you like, standard components they use to communicate plugin state between the plugin controller and the plugin processor, basically. So that's the essence of that, and maybe just the root class of the host that is exposed to the plugin. That's the only code that I've used within the VST3 support of plugin hosting. That said, there is the issue that, like, within the context of Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer, playback actually occurs through a command line application, so non-GUI application that runs in the background, that's basically called HB Player. So essentially that threw in the issue of how I was actually going to support the GUI side of the hosting, because the configuration hosting will have to sit on the player application, which doesn't have a GUI. So what was I going to use for the GUI in that particular instance? And given I didn't particularly want to bloat that application too much, I didn't really want to use what I use in Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer, which is WX widgets, basically, to do the GUI hosting. So instead I chose to actually just use the VST GUI support within the VST3 library itself to do most of that. There was a complication in that the VST3 GUI library basically only supports, if you like, a platform independent representation of GUI from the child frame downwards. So basically you need to implement a parent frame to actually hold the the child GUI in, and that you basically have to implement. Well, you can't implement that with VST3 GUI. You have to implement that yourself. So basically I had to spend quite a bit of time figuring out two hosting windows, if you like, for the two different platforms that I'm currently supporting, which is Windows and Mac OS. So the Windows one wasn't too much of a pain because I'm highly familiar with Win32 API. The Mac one was a little bit more complicated because it means diving into the depths of, I've forgotten the name of their GUI framework now, which is basically, if you want to write in it, you have to write in Objective-C++, which I'm not really I'm superficially familiar with it, but I don't have a great experience in that programming language, or indeed the GUI backend code for Mac OS. So that was somewhat of a challenge, made somewhat easier through the use of basically Gemini, asking Gemini how to do things. Yeah. One interesting aspect to that, and something that I really dreaded the thought of actually implementing, was how the hell was I going to implement the issue of automation in Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer. And the reason why I consider it a bit of a nightmare scenario, or did consider it a bit of a nightmare scenario, is because typically the way they implement automation on various doors usually involves things like parameter lanes represented in a GUI as a picture of how a particular GUI parameter, plugin parameter changes over time, and all the editing code associated with that. So just looking at that, my initial impression was, God, if I'm going to implement automation, there's going to be so much extra GUI stuff that I have to implement to handle this issue of automation lanes and the management of it, and it just wasn't a happy thought, thinking about the amount of work that I'd have to do to implement it. But in the process of doing that, it suddenly dawned on me that I could implement it in a completely different way than most doors implement it, which largely avoids using that automation lane representation of automation completely. So essentially the GUI component that I need to write is almost non-existent. You might think that, well, how would you do such a thing? How can you possibly do such a thing? Well, conceptually, the way, well, going back a little bit, the whole concept of the way they represent automation indoors is somewhat problematic to me anyway, from a design perspective, because it's almost like you represent your plugin in two different views. You've got the view from the perspective of the control panel of your plugin, and then you've got a completely different view, which is a graphical view represented in parameter lanes. So that, for me, in terms of a user, is problematic, because there's two different ways of controlling the parameters within your plugin, and to some degree they're in conflict. Like, you open up a plugin that has automation on it, you adjust a knob, and then suddenly it's adjusting a different way when it's playing back because it's got automated parameters in it. And then you've got the issue of like which one takes precedence. Is it the user? Is it the automation? And then you have the modal aspects of it, where you have a read mode, a write mode, and a read-write mode in automation. So it adds all these complexities because you've got these two different representations of your plugin state. So I was thinking about it and then came to the conclusion that instead of actually doing that, why not consider your automation plugin state as, instead of edit points on a timeline within an automation lane, why not just consider it a series of events in time that take snapshots of the entire parameter state of the plugin? So that's essentially what I've implemented. You basically take snapshots of a particular state of the plugin at a particular point in time, and you basically have two modes. You have a mode where automation is enabled and a mode where automation is disabled. And to avoid the conflict of who's in control, I've made it such that when you're actually configuring your automation, you always have automation switched off, so everything's static. So there is no conflict there between what your host wants to do and what you want to do, because there's only ever one actor in charge. So it's either the host via the automation, or it's you as either a completely manual user with no automation whatsoever, or you programming in the automation by selecting your parameters and capturing them at a particular point in time. So essentially, for instance, if you wanted to construct a complex hierarchy of automation, what you would do is you figure out what your parameter settings are for a particular point in time just by playing around and getting it. Then you can actually position your cursor point for your timeline to where you want to put the captured state, set your parameters to what you want it to do, and capture it, and then move on to the next point where you want it to change, set up new parameter values and capture it again. And by doing this, the other peculiarity with DAW implementations of automation is you've got this concept of whether indeed a parameter has automation associated with it. Not like you've got a complete list of parameters that are automatable within your plugin, but you may only, like in a particular DAW, you may only have one automation laneway for one particular parameter. And it's sort of something that gets decided by the user, but to another degree, it's also something that to some extent requires user configuration. Whereas in my case, if I'm just taking snapshots of complete plugin state, everything is defined completely by those state values. So there is no concept of whether a parameter is being automated or not, because that actually gets physically determined by your host automatically, just by comparing the state. So you look at your complete sets of parameters in 2 points in time. If none of the parameters are changing, then there's no automation. So yeah, and if only one of them is changing, then you know that only one of them you have to automate. So it gets determined in real time rather than having to be predefined by saying, all right, this parameter gets an automation lane and this parameter doesn't. So there's a lot of simplification to the back end by constructing a system of automation that works on that basis. I can actually show you a quick illustration of the type of hosting that I've implemented. It's basically, it's not actually implemented within Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer at this point in time because the complexity of, well, building complex code is an iterative process. It requires a lot of builds and debug sessions to assure oneself that the logic in the code is correct and things like that. So it would be very inefficient for me to actually try and build and design this automation layer within the context of a full Har-Bal harmonic balancer because it's so much more complicated in terms of a piece of the software. So the build cycles, the complexity of the build cycles and the run cycles and the debug sessions are so much more complicated. So all I've done is I've just done some minimalist code within a test application called HB Tests, which is basically just implementing a trivial set of processes associated with automation to demonstrate to myself that my logic is correct and everything is actually working. So what I'll show you is basically that, but it's just playing a hard-coded track and playing it through a single instance of, as it is in this case, the first plugin that it found, and the first plugin it finds is my Har-Bal limiter plugin. So you'll see what a plugin instance control panel will ultimately look like when it's within a Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer context. So let's switch over and have a look. So I'll just run my session. Here's the window. So you can see it's showing the same user interface. It's got this toolbar across the top. This is largely borrowed from the structure within Cubase that I've copied. So you've got A/B parameters, copy parameter. So for instance, now if I go there you go. Because this plugin doesn't have any presets, nothing will drop down. But this is a preset list. That's saving preset. These are my automation controls. So this is basically, well, this is automation off, automation on. So basically, what you do to design automation, click this pin button. What it's done is it's created a automation event at that particular time. I'll change that. It's created a second one. Created a third one. Okay, so it's gone back to the start. So I did a double loop so that you could I could demonstrate that the automation was actually working. So if I now switch this back on, well, I guess it's not going to do anything yet because it hasn't got to that point. So I'll just keep on discussing. So basically you've got this event list. So you can select a particular event. You can delete it with that button. Or is that, I can't remember. No, delete it with that button. That's saving another one. Actually, it's been quite a while since I've looked at this because I've been looking at something else at the same time. Now I've forgotten what some of these things are. I'd have to refresh my memory. But anyway, I put the automation on. We'll see if this thing changes when it comes to the appropriate part, which should be relatively soon. I think this is where our first event started, around about here. And as you can see, the gain control is moving up. So there you have it. That is a demonstration of what I have in terms of my hosting. The other thing that I've been working on, which I have, how long ago did I start this thing? I'm trying to think. Maybe 2 weeks, I guess, something like that. I was just idly thinking about all the recording work that I had done with Peter Pavlis, all his TSA recordings, and the fact that I'd been doing a lot of recordings both in stereo and 7.1, and the convenience or difficulty of going from stereo to 7.1, and thinking how much better it would be if I improved my wideband algorithm for stereo channel support, so that it could support the full surround sound format, despite not being able to effectively realize full 360-degree panning, but getting something slightly better than what it currently is now. So that then you can actually, for instance, do your mix entirely in 7.1 or whatever and get it sounding the way you want, and then easily translate it into stereo just by changing the channels that sits on, without actually having to alter any of your panning, and getting something that sounds close to, but obviously not exactly the same as the experience you would get for 7.1. So essentially that's what I've done. I've gone back to my spatial panner, gone back to the wide pan algorithm, and extended and redesigned it to support 360-degree panning, despite not actually hearing the full sound behind you effect, but without any degradation in the remainder of the panning behavior. If anything, an improvement. What it basically involved was the volume laws between the left and right channel for panning over the angles, I'd had to extend to the full 360-degree configuration. So it was extending that volume law relationship, but to also make it more effective, I had to include, or I included, a frequency response alteration model as well for left and right channel depending on the panning angle. It actually, yeah, I guess it exceeded my expectations on what it actually sounds like. It sounds, in my opinion, definitely superior to the previous incarnation, and it does allow you to do what I suggested the whole motivation for it was, which is to take a 7.1 or surround sound mix and then translate it pretty much directly into stereo just by changing the channel format of the channels that the spatial panner sits on, changing it from 7.1 to stereo or vice versa. And I can give you an example of that as well from a recording again that I did for Peter Pavlis. I can't remember the band's name now, but it's a band formed by the now deceased lead guitarist of TSA, and it was his wedding concert. So it was like a small venue. I guess it was like a dinner setting or something. Small venue, dinner and gathering setting, basically for his wedding guests. Yeah, it's a recording that I really like the sound of. Well, the ultimate sound of. Although the original live material is of good quality, it's got the classic issues associated with taking a live recording, taking it through a mixing desk and recording it to device, and then it's sounding all close mic'd and no atmosphere. It very much sounds like that. Probably also dynamic issues in dynamic control issues in the vocal, being overly dynamic compared to everything else, like all the instruments and whatever. So although it's well balanced in terms of the spectral content, the original suffers from the overly dynamic vocal and the lack of atmosphere, and maybe a bit of boxiness in the bass guitar part. But interestingly, the only thing I had to work off was a stereo submix coming out of the mixing desk at the live performance. So the entire 7.1 recording that I created was based off that stereo submix, plus he also had a stereo like Zoom field device recording from the back of the venue. So it's the combination of those two. So it's basically 4 audio tracks that I had to work with, and the, I guess, spatial image you get of a venue and that performance, I find quite exceptional, given how limited the amount of material you had to work with is. So anyway, I can actually show you that now. I shall switch that over and we'll have a look. So this is basically it. I've set it up so I can make a direct comparison between the original recording and what it actually sounds like post-processing. So those are the left-right channels of the stereo mix coming from the mixing desk, and these two tracks here are the left and right of the Zoom field recording. Because they're not time synchronized and there's a bit of drift involved, that's why it's got these edit points to try and keep the timing between the two tracks as close to in sync as possible, without having to resort to some other more sophisticated approach. But that's why those edit points exist. Here is the spatial panning layout. Basically, you've got the left and right channels here, and then I've got to sort of, if you like, reduce the starkness of left and right panning. I've put a distant and delayed image of the left channel on the right side and the right channel on the left side. Something that I've done quite a lot for his recordings, and positioned the ambience tracks behind, basically. So if I were to now show you what, and of course this is the original stereo that it came from. I haven't included the original Zoom field recording because that's nothing remarkable about that, so there's not a lot of point in adding it to this exercise. So if I now solo this and give you a feel for what the material was like that I had to work with, we'll start from here. So as you can see, it sounds quite detailed, free of noise. Just wait for his vocal to hear how that behaves. I'll maybe give it further.
Znowu jest 3:00 rano, a ja chodzę po mieszkaniu, a ty śpisz, śpisz nasycona śpi. Pieniądz robi pieniądz. Dziad koluje dziada. Ciało zżera ciało. Zdrada. Znowu zdrada. Znowu się uspokój, bo się kurwa nie mogę skupić. No. Trzecia koleżanka i potem następna. Oczywiście najpierwszym powodem do rozwodu jest ślub podobno.
So you can see from that there's, yeah, it's a very good stereo submix or stereo mix coming off the mixing desk and being recorded. It does have the slightly under controlled live recording quality to it, particularly the vocal, but even there where the bass guitar part, where they had that fortissimo, the volume change was quite substantial, and the sound of the crowd plus the sound of his vocal sound rather dead and lack of atmosphere there. So if I compare it to the other thing with the comparison is it's it's probably not really possible to have a completely fair comparison in terms of the dynamic range, because the dynamic range on the original material is substantially higher than what I've done in my remix, because I've got compression on, a limited amount of compression on here. I don't think it's much, but there definitely is some compression. What is it? 1.5, 50% compression on that. Plus there's also the controlling of dynamics in my re-equalization with Har-Bal Harmonic Balancer. So it definitely changes the volume comparison associated with the two, and it's hard to make a fair comparison because of the dynamic range differences of the two recordings. And again, I don't want to push the limiter on this original track here, because I do have a limiter on here, but I don't want to push the volume on here too much so that the limiter is taking a lot of action, because that in itself is sort of skewing and biasing the impression you get by controlling the excessive dynamics that are actually in the source material. So in terms of averages, particularly this quiet track, for instance, the average volume of my remix is maybe 3 dB louder than this, something in that order. So there is a bias associated with it, probably more, even more in the case of this quiet section where he's speaking. That's substantially louder. But anyway, I'll actually disable that to show you what my mix sounds like.
No tak. Ale tak to jest na tym świecie, że najpierw się kocha, później się nie kocha, potem się chodzi dookoła ratusza za rękę, potem się umawia na telefon, potem się wymienia SMS-y, jedna, druga. Znowu jest 3 rano, a ja... Znowu jest 3 rano, a ja chodzę po mieszkaniu. Znowu jest 3 rano, a ty śpisz. Znowu jest 3 rano, a ja chodzę po mieszkaniu. A ty śpisz, śpisz nasycona, śpi. Pieniądz robi pieniądz. Dziad koluje dziada. Ciało zżera ciało. Zdrada, znowu zdrada. Znowu jest 3 rano, a ja chodzę po mieszkaniu. A ty śpisz, śpisz nasycona, śpi. Znowu jest 3 rano, a ja chodzę po mieszkaniu. Diabeł. Ulica. Weź się spokój, bo się kurwa nie mogę skupić, naprawdę. No kurwa nie mogę się skupić, chłopie, no. Proszę cię. Ulica, nasza ukochana, nasza dzielnica i co widzimy? Widzimy ją, która sobie idzie tam sobie idzie właśnie. Księżycowa! Widzę, że też. Ja też byłem kiedyś młody. Też byłem młody, też wiesz. Też zadziorna, ale słuchajcie, ulica, nasza ukochana, nasza dzielnica i co widzimy? Widzimy ją, która sobie idzie tam sobie idzie właśnie. Księżycowa! Idę tak ulicą księżycową, idę sobie tam i wiem, co masz pod spódnicą, no i wiem, że tak. Idę tak od rana i patrzę na twoje kolana, kochana, niekochana. Patrzę na twe księżycowe lico i wiem, co masz pod spódnicą. Hej, hej, hej. Hej, hej. Kocham cię. Idę tak, idę tak, idę tak. Patrzę, ktoś tam leży na wznak. To jest moja ulica, dzielnica. Patrzę, idzie ideał. Au, 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 au. Ideał, au. Jakbym bardzo ciebie chciał. Jakbym bardzo ciebie chciał. Hej, hej, hej. Hej, hej. Kocham cię. Patrzę, a ktoś tak na ciebie patrzy. Patrzę, a on tak na ciebie patrzy. Więc wyrwałem chwasta, niech się chlasta. Więc wyrwałem chwasta, niech się chlasta. Już na ciebie się nie będzie patrzył, bo go dzisiaj wyrwałem. Wyrwałem chwasta, niech się chlasta. Niech się chlasta! Niech się chlasta! Nowak się rozluźnił!
So, there you have it. Hopefully you found that impressive. If not, so be it. I certainly find it impressive. To me, it completely transforms the atmosphere of that recording. It's actually funny that, like, for me, actually putting that remix together in reference to how wet it sounds in terms of the reverberation and things like that. It actually, like me in actually doing that in the process, I would feel that I was being quite conservative in terms of how live I was actually making it sound. But once you actually put in the raw stereo track and then compare it side by side, it suddenly becomes so much more obvious how much I've actually put in there. Because the live stereo mix off the mixing desk just sounds so completely dead in comparison. But yeah, I guess in terms of my approach to the whole issue is I'm working off a mindset of how I would have expected to hear it if I was sitting in the audience, and I would argue that the wetness of my mix is pretty much in line with what you would typically expect in a live performance in that sort of situation. I can't say for sure because I don't know what the venue was like, but certainly a high quality venue with good acoustics, that's the sort of thing I would have expected in terms of a musical impression, that you're hearing a lot of reflected sound as opposed to a lot of direct sound. And basically the processing that I've done actually achieves that without actually compromising the intelligibility. I think the intelligibility, if anything, is improved in my mix compared to the original. Probably another comment I would make in regard to that, which is probably pertinent to some comments I've had in the past regarding my mixes being too wet or the like. It entirely depends on what your monitoring you're using is. So for instance, what I mean by that is some people may have, maybe performing monitoring with actual physical speakers rather than headphones, and doing so in a room that itself has quite a bit of live and reflected sound. So in such an environment where you've got quite a bit of live reflected sound coming about because of your listening environment, it's quite possible that you could play back the original raw audio and hear something you think sounds superior to what I've got. And that's basically because your room is now adding that missing reflected sound in the original material. Now, whether that is a good thing to be basing your judgment off is a debatable point, because although that's perfectly valid and that really does work in terms of studio monitoring, if you've got a studio that has a live sound sense to it, and you play back the average rather dead sounding multi-track recording, or whatever, a mix of a multi-track recording which is rather dead through your system that's got a bit of liveness and reflected sound because of the listening environment, it could well sound absolutely exceptional. But the problem is, how representative is that of the way most people are going to be hearing it? I would argue that most people particularly nowadays, will be hearing recordings. The predominant environment they're going to be hearing recordings in is headphones, basically, which are completely dead. There's nothing, no atmosphere whatsoever. It's completely dead. So if you've got a completely dead recording and you're playing it back through headphones, it's going to sound, less than impressive. It's going to sound nothing like what it will sound like in somebody's studio that's got a relatively live RT60. So that's basically where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the perspective that, and to further hammer that point, my actual listening environment, even though I do have rear wall diffusers and diffusers at the side, I've got quite a lot of damping in my room. It's got a pretty short RT60, so it's close to, you could say it's close to a dead room. It's not a completely dead room, but I'm pretty sure, like I've measured the RT60 of it before, and it's in the order of about 120 or 130 milliseconds, like a tenth of a second. It's not a long RT60 at all, so it's a pretty dead room. So yeah, if I listen to the original on my speakers in my room, that's basically the impression I get. It sounds like a really dead recording. It's rather lifeless. So that essentially is where my bent or my direction in terms of adding reverberation and reverberant sound to a mix is coming from. It's coming from that place that the environment that I listen to it in is rather dead, and also the target environment for the majority of people is going to be a relatively dead environment. And also, even in the context of, say, living room stereo systems, the majority of households have carpeted floors. They have carpeted floors, they have curtains. So the majority of living rooms in themselves are going to be relatively dead as well. So it's the same issue. So if you've got a studio that's optimized for listening of material by raising the RT60 to a nice level, that's great for your listening, but it's not representative of what everybody else is going to be hearing. So yeah, you got to be careful about making judgments about things like that. Whether it matters to you or not, it doesn't really matter. In terms of, I'm easy either way. I have my views, and I'm happy to respect whatever your views are. I guess the one other thing that I forgot to mention, which I can show now, if I go back to my computer and look at this, I have also added this feature here to my spatial panner, apart from the fact that I now have the ability to do full 360 panning setups in a stereo mix. But if you look at the configuration for this, there's this added parameter called LF cutoff, low frequency cutoff. I actually added this last year sometime, but I haven't released the software yet. Basically the idea behind this is that for small rooms, this is getting on toward being small. For small rooms, you have the issue that you have relatively short early reflection delay times, and The problem with that is the shorter they get, the more broad any low frequency notching becomes. And that leads to strong coloration of the low frequency end of your music. That's essentially why people, I'm going to actually switch back to my original view. That's essentially why people say it's not great to have a small room for your studio listening. Basically because the low frequency distortions that your room will be providing is going to color the music significantly because of the broad notching at the low frequency end, because the bandwidth of those notches is related to that length of time, and the time delay is so short that it starts becoming a sizable chunk of bandwidth that gets attenuated because of that. So I introduced that LF cutoff, which is basically a low frequency cutoff that is applied to all the reflections. So the idea behind that is you reduce the amount of low frequency material coming off those reflections, and as a consequence, the low frequency notching caused by that in small rooms will be substantially less. So that's the basis behind that. In terms of how it actually works and how it sounds, it definitely does have that effect upon it, but I don't find it a substantially different outcome. But it's definitely worthwhile having, and that's what it's there for. But I think that's pretty much as much as I would like to discuss at this point in time. I think I've probably kept you for long enough, and I'll leave it at that.